So when I first saw the trailer of this movie, I was really excited to go and watch it. And not just the trailer, but as you can see on Rotten Tomatoes, this film got a 93%, which is extremely unusual for a horror movie. Because normally horror movies get horrible reviews, pun not intended, on Rotten Tomatoes and by critics. For whatever reason, critics hate horror movies, but they like art films and they like bad Star Wars movies like The Last Jedi or Solo. So they'll give those films good reviews, but horror movies almost always get terrible ones. And I think it's kind of a shame because I think horror movies are very underappreciated compared to other films. And there's a number of reasons for that. I think the first is I can see a bad horror movie and I won't be bored watching it. Like I can watch some garbage action movie like Brick Mansions or something and I'll be bored out of my mind and want to turn it off. But I find, like, if you're looking at a bad horror movie, it's at least, like, visually interesting, or they'll explore kind of some interesting moral dilemma or metaphysical concept, or there'll be interesting special effects. There's normally something within a horror movie that kind of keeps you interested and kind of guessing towards the end. And that's kind of a complaint I often will have about trailers for horror movies, is they'll give away, like, 90% of the film's plot, everything up to the final twist. And kind of going into a horror film without really knowing what to expect is a really critical. And it's kind of, I guess when you're making a trailer for it, there's kind of a catch-22 or a... Because do you make the trailer represent the movie and you make it kind of show off what the film's going to be, what the plot's going to be, or do you try to deliberately mislead the audience? Because if you mislead the audience, then they'll go in without really knowing what's happening, and that can be a good thing, or that can be a bad thing. That can be something like this film, which I think semi-successfully does it, although it's still kind of a disappointment what they came up with, in my view. And then there's something like Catfish, which is kind of a big FU to the audience. So, like I said, it's you give away the film's plot, like the film's twist. Like if you're watching the Sixth Sense trailer, do you say, oh, it's the guy's dead, the kid sees dead people, what a twist, or do you deliberately mislead them? And it's kind of an interesting meta question. But I like horror movies for that. There's also the aspect of horror movies that they're more kind of conservative. Or politically right-wing, I guess you could say, than other movie genres, because they deal very much with the concept of sin. Now, it's disproportionate sin. I think that's important to keep in mind, because it can be something very minor that the person gets, like, excessively punished for. Like in It Follows, there's just some dumb teenagers having sex, but you have the STD, the sexually transmitted demon, hunting them down and killing them. So it is disproportionate to what they did, but there is an aspect of sin involved and people being punished for something they did. You also see that in the Friday the 13th movies, where Jason becomes an insane zombie because the two counselors were having sex and let him die. So actions having consequences. The Ring is also very much like that, where within The Ring, if they didn't watch the videotape, if they just let it well enough alone, then you wouldn't have this pervasive Samara coming out and just killing everybody. So that's kind of, I think, something that really draws me to it. Also, it deals with normally religious issues. It deals with kind of metaphysical or moral issues that other films just don't deal with. So, like I said, even if it's a bad horror movie, even if it's kind of trashy, it's still interesting in a lot of ways. And I'd rather watch a bad horror movie than a mediocre action movie. Like, I'd rather watch a 3 out of 10 horror movie than a 6 out of 10 action movie any day of the week, because I always have something kind of interesting to say, or I kind of come away with kind of some interesting thoughts. So, Hereditary. We're going to watch the trailer, and I'm going to kind of talk about it, because this is a case of where the trailer, I think, really misrepresents the movie, and is that a good thing, is that a bad thing? So, one of the things that kind of drew me to this movie was it seemed to really focus on the theme of mental illness. And if you watch my channel for any amount of time, I suffer from bipolar type 2 and anxiety disorder, and it's fairly common within my family. So it's a topic of a lot of interest for me, and I think the idea of kind of featuring it more prominently in horror films is really good, because often the greatest horrors don't lie within some sort of cosmic demon or some sort of, I don't know, bizarre mystery, but within the human mind. Our own perceptions, our own kind of becoming prisoner of your own thoughts is every bit as scary as some kind of supernatural thing. Not to say I don't love supernatural horror, but I think there's a place for having something that mainly reflects kind of mental illness and is the horrors within the human mind. And when I saw kind of the trailer for this and I saw the title, I thought what this was about was, well, hereditary mental illness. A lot of mental illness, be it schizophrenia, bipolar, I think borderline, is very highly correlated with genetics. If your mother or father had bipolar, you're very likely to inherit it. I think it's several dozen or several hundred times more likely. If somebody in your family has schizophrenia, you likely carry the gene for it. And there's kind of a fear, I think, with a lot of people who have these disorders. Do I breed? Do I reproduce? Because you're worried about passing it on to your children. And that's kind of a theme in this movie that I think could have been explored a bit more. And once again, we're going to have spoilers, because these reviews always have spoilers. My kind of issue with this film was I thought it was going to be not supernatural. And while I normally like supernatural horror, I think in this case it would have been scarier and it would have been a more interesting film if there was just no supernatural aspects to it and it was entirely about the insanity within the human mind, the darkness within the human soul, and that kind of thing. But I think they kind of dropped the ball, and the last 30 minutes of this film self-destructed. The last kind of end of a horror movie where they reveal everything is really the make or break point for a film of the genre. Is it going to kind of bring everything together, or is it going to collapse under its own weight, and it becomes very clear that the creators of the film had no idea what the hell they were doing? So this one, as with a lot of movies, is kind of a mixture of both. So let's watch the trailer, and I'll give context to it as we go. So this is kind of an immediate theme throughout the movie, is the main character, Annie, works as a professional miniature creator. She makes miniatures for museums and art galleries and stuff, which is interesting because I've never really thought about where that stuff comes from. And I guess there is not very many people with that skill set, and I suppose there is kind of a market for it, because if you go into a lot of museums, they'll have like a cross-section of ancient Roman house or a hospital or something, and that is fairly common within museums, and I've seen them in buildings and stuff. So I'd imagine it actually probably pays pretty well, because not a lot of people have the skill set, and the kind of clients who would purchase them tend to have fairly large budgets. But I like it because I like when they put kind of additional touches to characters to kind of make them more fleshed out. It's very easy if you add in a dog, is a very common one, if you add in a hobby, that kind of thing. Like something with Thrawn in Star Wars is they made him an art aficionado, which is kind of, it adds just a little bit of depth to him, and they kind of integrated that into his military strategy. And with Pelion, they added in that he likes to garden, which once again just kind of adds that little bit of extra depth and adds in kind of something interesting you might not expect. And in this case, this is a very unusual profession, and it kind of serves as an interesting microcosm for, she can control this, but she can't control the other aspects of her life. So, yeah.
Come on, Peter. Let's just do it.
So interestingly, that is not actually the funeral of her mother, that's the funeral of her daughter, and we'll get into that in a minute.
It's heartening to see so many strange new faces here today. I know my mom would be very touched and probably a little suspicious.
So you can tell right away, just from the way she's talking, that she's paranoid. She probably might have schizophrenia, bipolar. She has some form of mental illness. And that thing you can see there, that symbol, is kind of a reoccurring motif throughout the movie.
My mother was a very secretive and private woman.
And here's kind of a disturbing thing she has is she deals with kind of her mental illness by making these figurines. Oftentimes they can be grotesque and disturbing images.
It's Grandma?
So yeah, so at the funeral she gave kind of like the most awkward... So the film starts off with her at the funeral, her mother's dead, and she gives this extremely awkward eulogy. And kind of... You feel like this is going to be the focus of the movie, is kind of, and I think the trailer gives that impression, is her trying to uncover stuff about her mother. What kind of shady stuff was her grandmother involved in? Was there demonic stuff? Was it just her grandmother was insane? That kind of thing. But that turns out not being particularly important to the film's plot, and they kind of dropped that after the first 20 minutes, which is kind of strange.
You know you were her favorite, right? Even when you were a little baby, she wouldn't let me feed you because she needed to feed you. She was a very difficult woman, which...
Okay, so this is kind of one of my early issues with the film, is Peter. He doesn't look anything like his parents. He doesn't even look like he's the same race as them. He looks like he's, I don't know, Indian or Middle Eastern or half native or something. And this was kind of a point of confusion for me, because Annie is Toni Collette is obviously like French American or French Anglo, and Gabriel Byrne is obviously Irish, and they're both kind of like pasty Anglos. And then you have this guy who looks like, at the very least, like Southern Mediterranean, and doesn't even look like he's white. So I thought that it was my wife's son situation, and he was the son from a previous marriage to some other random guy. But I think the movie established that he's actually her current husband Steve's son, which just kind of confused me. And for most of this film, I thought he was not actually Steve's son, because he doesn't look like the same race as his parents, and it's a really weird casting choice.
Very difficult woman, which maybe explains me.
I recognize you from your mother.
What? Sometimes I swear I can feel them in the room.
She isn't gone.
And doesn't this look like it doesn't really look supernatural, does it? It looks like her mother was some kind of psycho who inherited this, and she's worried that she inherited the mental illness from her grandmother, and it looks like her daughter also inherited the mental illness from her. So it doesn't look supernatural at all at the moment. Cutting the heads off of birds, I've actually heard a fair amount with reference to people with childhood mental illness, particularly people who have psychopathy or some form of antisocial personality disorder.
Private friends.
Who's gonna take care of me
You don't think I'm gonna take care of you?
when you die?
She wasn't altogether there. At the end.
Yeah, so this kind of completely misrepresents the entire plot of the film. It's really weird.
I don't like this. Dad, I don't like this.
I just don't want to put any more stress on my parents.
Yeah, like there's nothing obviously supernatural about this trailer, and like I said, it makes it look like it's just going to be about mental illness. So let's just kind of go through what the film's actual story was. As I said, her mother dies at the beginning of the movie, and she lives with her husband Steve and her son Peter and her daughter Charlie. Early in the movie, Stephen is informed that the grave of the mother has been vandalized and her body has been taken away. So Steve doesn't tell her that, because Annie pretends to go out to see a movie, ironically enough, which is kind of meta, but instead she goes to a support group, and at the support group we get this impression that this film is not going to be supernatural, because she says that her father suffered from depression and starved himself to death. Her schizophrenic brother accused her mother of trying to put people inside his body and committed suicide. and Ellen herself suffered from dissociative identity disorder. And it's pretty clear from this movie that Annie, the main character, suffers from schizophrenia. So, once again, I keep bringing this up, this is what I thought was going to happen, that the supernatural elements in this movie were going to be a side effect of Annie's schizophrenia, and it was going to be left ambiguous towards the end, and the big reveal was going to be that this was all in her head, and that she was actively doing all of this stuff. We also have Charlie, who's her daughter, who seems to be completely insane. She was very close to the grandmother. As you can see in the trailer, she's like, oh, you belong to her. She wouldn't let me feed her. She had to feed you. So there's this closeness between them, and she takes the grandmother's death really hard. So she kind of starts to become comatose, and she does weird things like cutting the heads off of birds. She starts developing these rituals. She starts kind of creating these weird toys that kind of look like idols. It's a really just kind of bizarre, disturbing trend. So you're wondering, once again, is she possessed by a demon? Is this just an inherited mental illness from her mother? Is she developing childhood schizophrenia? You don't really know. Peter, as a weed addict, and there's a party happening, and he likes this girl in his class, so he decides to go to the party, and he lies to his mother and says it's a school barbecue. Because he wants to go there and give her weed, so she'll become his weed foo, I guess. His waifu, but while smoking a joint. Annie forces him to take his sister with him, and he abandons her at the party to go and try to get laid by giving the girl he likes weed. However, Annie eats cake that has walnuts in it, and she goes into anaphylactic shock. So Peter starts driving really quick to the hospital, and Charlie, trying to breathe, sticks her head outside of the window, and Peter swerves to avoid hitting a dead animal, and it decapitates her. Peter becomes catatonic after this and just goes home and lies in his bed, unable to sleep, and they find her decapitated body, and we're treated to a disturbing image of her head being eaten by ants. So at this point, Annie has just become completely unhinged and is getting crazier by the day. So Peter and Annie become non-existent between the two of them. We find out that Annie has a habit of sleepwalking, and one time when she was sleepwalking, she poured paint thinner all over herself and Peter and was going to light them both on fire. She tried to light a match, and when she lit the match, she woke up. So Peter woke up once with her trying to basically light them both on fire, and at one point in the movie it's implied that she tries to rip Peter's head off when he's sleeping. So Peter is becoming increasingly scared. I think that's one of the stronger points of the movie is his performance, because a lot of times in horror movies you can't really see the gradual destabilization of the person. You can't really see them gradually kind of losing it as all this weird stuff is happening around them and people are, like I said, being strange. And he really, I think, gives a good performance in that. And you're wondering, has he also inherited his mother's mental illness, and is the events triggering it? And I use that term unironically. So Annie goes back to the support group, and she meets a woman named Joan. So Joan tells her that, much like her son and grandson both died, and Annie immediately connects with her, seeing as one of the few people who can maybe understand her pain. So they meet a couple times and try to talk to one, and they kind of start working through her problems. However, Annie goes back and kind of into herself and starts, like I said, losing it. She starts sleeping in her daughter's treehouse every night. Her husband tries really hard to be supportive, but he doesn't like how she's, kind of losing it. And one of the issues with kind of, like I said, the whole situation is she's scaring their son to the point that he's becoming completely just incapable of functioning. And the father kind of takes the perspective that he needs to protect his son, because Annie's obviously completely lost it and there's not a lot he can do about her, but he can kind of try to salvage. There's at least one member of his family he can try to salvage. When Annie's going to pick up more stuff for her miniatures, she runs into Joan again, and Joan tells her that she's completely recovered from her grief by being able to perform a seance. Now, earlier in the film, we saw a pamphlet for a seance being put into their door, like into the mailbox. So my thought process was, okay, so it's just it's a delusion of her. She's imagining Joan. The seance is something that she does. This is just her. She read it, and this is her brain trying to, like, in its sick state, trying to rationalize it. So they go and they succeed in contacting the grandson of Joan. So Annie decides that she's going to do it herself, and Joan gives her this phrase in Babylonian or something she needs to read. So she reads it, and she's able to make contact with her dead daughter. She then presses her husband, forces basically her husband and son to participate in a ritual, and a bunch of weird stuff happens. Flames jump up from a thing on the table. It seems like a window gets broken, and Peter becomes almost catatonically frightened, and Charlie seems to possess Annie at the end of it. And other weird stuff starts happening. They start seeing kind of apparitions around the house. You see Charlie was obsessed with drawing, and you see Charlie kind of constantly writing stuff. Her notebook constantly filling up. So once again, Steve thinks it's just Annie. He thinks that that she's doing the whole thing, and in her schizophrenia, she thinks it's Charlie has come back from the dead. But really, she's trying, in her grief, trying to kind of come up with this insane way of rationalizing Charlie's death through this whole mediumship thing. So things kind of continue to get worse and worse, and Annie tells Peter that she tried to miscarry him pregnant with him because she didn't want to him, which is pretty messed up. Like, I don't know what would be worse than if you were born alive as the result of a botched late-term abortion and your parents raised you, knowing that your mother didn't want you and actively tried to kill you. Like, that's got to be really messed up. So it's around this part in time that the movie, I think, kind of starts to take its pivot, where she goes back to Joan's apartment, but Joan is gone, and you look through the window into Joan's apartment, and she has some, like, weird altar set up to try to, like, it looks like it's like some voodoo stuff to try to control Peter or that sort of thing. So Annie goes through her mother's stuff and finds a photo album linking Joan to Ellen. It also appears that Joan has not aged in the last 50 to 60 years, because she kind of finds pictures all throughout her mother's life, and Joan is the same age in all of them, and the same age as when she met her. So you start to kind of think maybe there's supernatural stuff going on here. She also finds a book about demons, which has highlighted I'm not going to, Paimon, I think his name is, a mischievous doesn't mean like jackass or like practical jokes. It means like a really malicious demon that tries to make people think that they're insane. So the demon wants to inhabit the body of males and waits for them to become vulnerable enough to possess them. So looking for more of Ellen's stuff, she goes into the attic and finds the headless corpse that appears to be Ellen. Annie believes that Ellen allowed Charlie to be possessed by the demon at birth, and that when she was killed, the spirit moved on to Peter. So Annie shows Steve her mother's body and sketchbook, insisting he burn it. Now, this is kind of where I think the movie could have really made an interesting statement, where Steve believes that Ellen has gone insane by this point in time. He thinks that she's the one who dug up the body, that the sketchbook is just stuff she came up with, that she's the person who's just been behind all the weird stuff going on, that Joan was just some random person she saw in her mother's sketchbooks, and she found some random occult book, and her diseased mind put all these things together and like I said, just crafted this insane narrative. He goes to call the police, And as he's going to call the police, Annie takes Charlie's sketchbook and throws it into the fire, and it causes Steve to burst into flames and die. Which is, once again, it's just, I don't know, it's still a little ambiguous at this point. Is this all just something in Annie's mind? Is she killing these people? The movie just goes completely insane at this point. Peter awakens and finds his father's dead body. He gets chased by a possessed Annie into the attic. More of Ellen's followers confront him. Annie appears on the ceiling, decapitating herself with a wire. Peter walks out jumps out the window, is knocked unconscious. So he wakes up and follows Annie's levitating corpse into the treehouse, and he finds Charlie's head resting atop a statue of Paimon and Joan, and other members of the cult, along with the headless corpses of his mother and grandmother, are bowing to him. He's crowned by Joan, who welcomes him as Charlie and Paimon, and the movie ends. So, once again, it's why did we have to go down this supernatural? Why do we have to bring in this, like, satanic cult? I don't see what was necessary about this. I think, if anything, it really detracts from the experience of the film. I would have much preferred if this whole thing was just a delusion of Annie, and she made this whole thing up because of her own, like I said, mental illness, and her inability to accept the death of both her mother and her daughter around the same time. Her trying to kind of find meaning in something that was a tragic accident. But that wasn't the case, and I think the film really cops out. I don't know if they didn't want to pathologize people with mental illness too much, or what kind of the logic of it was, but I think it really detracted from the film, and they missed a really good opportunity. So overall, I think it's not a bad movie. I think it's interesting. I think there's a lot of good aspects to it, but it really represents a missed opportunity to kind of take the horror movie genre in a different direction. So I hope you enjoyed the review. More to come, and I'll talk to you guys later.